talk tonight is to sort of provide a historical context for the Blue Cabin. Not to talk about the cabin itself, which Jeremy Borsos did so well last week, if any of you were here, but about cabins like it, which at one time lined the shores of Burrard Inlet and False Creek, pretty much since the beginning of the city. First of all, I want to mention that we've had a slight technical problem, so I'm unable to move my slides forward. I have a capable assistant to do that, so if you see me nodding my head, I haven't developed a nervous tic. It's the system we've worked out. So Vancouver memorably has been called the city of glass. It's often defined by those shiny high-rises that dominate the civic skyline, or the handsome Tudor mansions that we know from the west side of the city. I want to talk about another kind of humbler structure that's just as familiar, I think, to most Vancouverites, certainly Vancouverites of a certain age. At least it was until the 1950s. The squatter's cabin, I think, is equally iconic, equally commonplace as these other structures, but it projects kind of a different image of the city, a view from the margins instead of from the center. Hundreds of these structures once lined the shores of Burrard Inlet and False Creek, slumped on barges or tottering on stilts above the high tide line. From the very beginning of the city, squatting has been one solution to the challenge of finding affordable housing. So I want to point out right off the bat that everyone who has come to live in Vancouver is a squatter. Vancouver is a settler city located on land that was occupied and is still claimed by the local First Nations, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, the Musqueam. The process of settlement by outsiders involved the transformation of Euro-American squatters into lawful residents and Indigenous people into squatters on their own land. To put it another way, the process of settlement involved transforming land into property. But once this was done, there are still many non-Indigenous people who could not afford to own property, so they made homes for themselves on land which did not belong to them. And these are the people we are usually referring to when we use the term squatter. Squatters are usually considered marginal to the history of the city, but what I want to do tonight is to touch on a series of historical incidents that highlight the significant role that they actually played. Most of you will recognize this fellow, Gassy Jack Dayton, the reputed founder of Gastown. Dayton was a riverboat pilot who arrived in a canoe one afternoon in September 1867 on the shores of Burrard Inlet with his Squamish wife, Wahelia, a barrel of whiskey, and a primitive business plan. Offering free drinks to anyone who would help him, he threw together his original saloon. It was up and running about 24 hours after he arrived, mainly serving the mill hands from the local mill, eventually Hastings Mill. No one seemed to care that he didn't own the land on which the saloon stood. Technically, Gassy Jack was Vancouver's first squatter. His saloon stood on land which had been set aside as one of the several government reserves created in 1860. Another was the future site of Stanley Park. And it was another 3 years before surveyors laid out a town site that was known as Granville, and lots were offered at auction, at which point Gassy Jack actually purchased a lot at the corner of Water and Carroll Street, where he erected a new hotel, the 2-story Dayton House. So Gassy Jack, the unofficial mayor of Granville, had gone from being an unsavory squatter to one of the town's leading businessmen. This is Water Street in about 1880, 10 years after Dayton's Saloon opened. And his saloon, I think, was behind the maple tree there in the corner. Although by the time this photo was taken in 1880, he had died. This is the view of the Vancouver waterfront in 1890. I just want to direct your attention to these buildings right there. So once the city was created, there were hundreds of people who were squatting in structures like those three along the waterfront. As you can see, the shacks, well, you can't see very clearly, they either stood on stilts or were up on barges. In 1889, the World newspaper surveyed the Vancouver waterfront, and the reporter counted 233 what he called floating cabins, inhabited by a wide array of squatters from all over the world. A few years later, a similar survey by another newspaper counted 364 such shacks. The World reporter actually described the interior furnishings of the cabins. He described 2 homemade bunks, a rough boarded table, and perhaps 2 boxes for chairs. Heat came from a wood-burning stove, with using, of course, fuel scavenged from the beach. Most of the occupants were men who worked as mill hands or picked up whatever laboring jobs they could find. Respectable elements in the city objected to the shacks and wanted them removed, but they provided affordable accommodation for much of the city's working class, who, according to the World newspaper, purchased more permanent homes as soon as they could afford to. So one way of thinking of the squatters' shack is that they were starter homes for the city's working class. One notorious squatting neighborhood was the so-called Indian Rancherie, just to the east of Hastings Mill. This photo shows what I believe is the rancherie in 1886. These cabins down here, I think, are squatters' shacks. This is Alexander Street, the railway track. Most of the residents of the rancherie were Aboriginal mill workers and longshoremen and their families, who had settled close to their place of employment at the mill. In 1884, the rancherie was the site of what was reputed to be the last potlatch held within the boundaries of Vancouver. Churchmen and civic officials thought that the rancherie was a shameful center of depravity, and they wanted it gone, if for no other reason than the CPR main line ran right through the shantytown, and the railway didn't like its passengers having to look out on such sites. So in July 1887, police descended on the rancherie and evicted all of its residents. Some of the squatters must have returned, however, because 5 years later, a reporter, again from the Vancouver World, visited the site, described it as consisting of 2 straggling rows of huts or shacks that lined the foreshore. The rancherie, he claimed, was the gathering spot for the lowest of the low. According to press reports, bootleggers came to sell their liquor and drunken brawls were common. So finally, in 1896, the city's medical officer supervised the final destruction of the shacks in the interest of public health. But as we'll see, this is just the beginning, not the end of squatting in Burrard Inlet. Stanley Park had a long and contentious history of squatting, well told actually by Jean Barman in her wonderful book, Stanley Park's Secret, and also by Sean Carrage in his environmental history of the park. Before the arrival of white settlers, Squamish people inhabited village sites at Chathus, Prospect Point, and Wayway, Lumberman's Arch. Residents of Wayway greeted Captain Vancouver and his men when they passed through the first Narrows in 1792. The people who lived there dug clams, they fished, killed waterfowl, utilized the cedar forest to build their homes, and so on. As well, the Squamish and the Musqueam lived at least seasonally at several other spots around the park. This photo shows homes either on the shore of Lost Lagoon or at Prospect Point in 1868. In 1876, the federal and provincial governments appointed the Joint Indian Reserve Commission to resolve the issue of Aboriginal land rights in the province. The three-person commission arrived at Wayway on November 16, 1876. Though 50 people inhabited the site at the time, the commissioners mistakenly believed that Wayway was actually a recent village. In other words, the indigenous inhabitants were thought to be squatters. They received no reserve, and in 1888, when the construction of the Park Road passed right through their settlement, the people were forced to relocate to Squamish and Musqueam reserves on the North Shore and in South Vancouver. This photo shows the road construction which unearthed layers of shell at the site. A shell that was later used, of course, to surface the road. Well, this photo is an early view of the beach at Lumberman's Arch. A few years after the relocation of the people from Wayway, the park board burned the remaining buildings. Only one person remained, a Squamish woman known as Aunt Sally, who continued to live in the park until she died in 1923. Her daughter, Mariah, then sold the property to the Parks Board, which burned it. This is a photo of the south side of Brockton Point in 1886, showing another squatter settlement. This group of families began settling here in the 1860s. They were a mixture of First Nations, Portuguese, and other people. Though technically squatters in the sense that they didn't enjoy legal possession of their lots, they had long ties to their properties. The Parks Board tolerated this community, at least for a few years. This is another view of the community, taken in the 1910s. The boats might have been used for fishing in the inlet or carrying some of the residents to work at the mill on the other side of the downtown. The fencing indicates perhaps livestock was kept, pigs, a cow. Finally, in 1923, the federal government, on behalf of the city, launched eviction efforts in the courts to get rid of this community. 8 families were involved. The case eventually ended up in the Supreme Court, which ruled against the families, and in 1931 they were removed, with the exception of 2 individuals, Agnes Cummings and her visually impaired brother Tim, whose family was deemed to have been there longer than the other litigants and were allowed to remain. I should mention another small group of squatters. These were Chinese families living at Anderson Point, overlooking the site of what is now the Royal Van Yacht Club, so in this area here. The context for this group was that early in 1887, a group of Chinese workers who had been brought in to clear land in the West End by a contractor was attacked by a mob of people from Vancouver, a mob of white residents, and basically forced to leave the city. In fact, the next day, most of the Chinese inhabitants of the city were forced onto a steamer to take them to Victoria. The provincial government was hardly sympathetic to the Chinese, but at the same time, it objected to what it saw as the mob taking the law into its own hands. So the legislature decided this was anarchy, lifted the city charter, and sent in armed constables to keep the peace, effectively putting the city under martial law. Under the protection of the province, some Chinese people returned, and one small group settled here at Anderson Point, where they had small holdings. However, the persecution continued, and in 1890, under the pretext that they presented a threat to public health, the park board ordered the ranger to burn down these houses, which he did. Obviously, Stanley Park was a favorite spot for squatters. I guess it still is. And during the 1890s, yet another squatting community sprang up on the shores of Dead Man's Island. 1890 is when this photo showing some of the cabins was taken. This community became embroiled in the notorious Battle for Dead Man's Island, which began in 1899 when the federal government gave this man, a Seattle lumberman named Theodore Ludgate, a 25-year lease on Dead Man's Island in return for a payment of $500 a year and a promise that he was going to build a sawmill and clear-cut the island. The city, for its part, believed that it owned the island and the feds had no right to give up the lease. The city considered it to be part of Stanley Park. So early one April morning in 1899, when Ludgate and his men arrived at the island to begin logging, they were met by the mayor, James Garden, and a troop of 25 police officers. And when the loggers tried to start felling trees, Ludgate and all his men were arrested. And this was sort of the first shot in the battle for Dead Man's Island. Opposition to his plans were led by prominent residents of the West End who wished to protect the park and their neighborhood from industrial development. But Ludgate's efforts were sort of supported by many working people in the city who hoped to get jobs at the mill and were more or less supporters of industrial development of any kind. At issue, as well as the mill, was this question of who actually owned the island, who actually owned Stanley Park, the city or the federal government. 3 weeks after the initial skirmish, Ludgate returned and managed to supervise the clear-cutting of half the island before once again the cops showed up, arrested him, and carted him off to jail. And then we enter a phase of litigation where the province sues, the feds sue back, the province is suing on behalf of the city. The matter goes to the Supreme Court, eventually to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, who rules in Ottawa's favor, which means technically that Ludgate can go ahead and log the island, which brings us back to the squatters, about 150 of whom inhabited shacks and float houses along the beach, as you can see in this image. Once his lease was confirmed, Ludgate began to evict these people, or at least to try to evict them, because they refused to go. Even at one point when he burned down some of the shacks in an attempt to drive the squatters away. In the end, the battle for Dead Man's Island turned into more of a war of attrition, and Ludgate lost. No mill was ever built, and after his death in 1918, the island reverted back to the federal government. And then in 1930, the city's park board gained jurisdiction, and they took steps to evict the village of squatters, shown here as it looked at about that time. Here's one member of the Dead Man's Island community, photographed in 1931. Unfortunately, I don't know his name. The photograph is from the city archive and doesn't contain a name. Anyway, during World War II, the Federal Department of Defense took control of the island, and since 1944, of course, it's been home to HMCS Discovery, a naval cadet training facility. So for many years, the Canadian Pacific Railway, of course, was the largest and richest landowner in the city. The city of, I think we are aware that it came into existence because the railway chose to locate its Pacific terminus down on Burrard Inlet, and received a massive land grant which contained much of the present city of Vancouver in return. In the process, it attracted a fair amount of resentment, the company, for the arrogance with which it threw its weight around. And during the 1890s, a squatter named Sam Greer focused some of this resentment and became a folk hero in the city, and this is he. Greer was an Irishman who came to BC during the gold rush, then drifted down to the coast, and in the early 1880s obtained what he believed was title to a large piece of property in Kitsilano, up behind Kitsilano Beach. In other words, he arrived before the CPR had received its generous land grant from the province, which included most of the Kitsilano area as far west as Trafalgar Street. Greer built a small cabin near the beach at the foot of U Street, where he lived with his wife and his daughter. In fact, he was so identified with the spot that Kitsilano Beach was known as Greer's Beach. Here it is in 1889. To the Squamish, the place was known as Squayuse and was an excellent place to catch smelt. Greer was adamant that he held his hand legally. There were several court cases. In the end, the court ruled in favor of the railway and declared that Greer was a squatter and had to go. So in September 1891, police deputies arrived at the beach to evict him. He responded by firing a shotgun through the door, wounding one of the officers. The police retreated, but returned later in the day and arrested Greer for attempted murder. He was found guilty on a lesser charge of assault and sent to the penitentiary, but apparently public sentiment was in his favor for standing up to the rail company, and it wasn't long before he won a pardon and was released from jail. Kind of an aside is that his daughter, the young daughter who lived in the cabin at that time, was named Jessie, and it's somewhat ironic that she grew up to marry a prominent Vancouver businessman, J.Z. Hall, and they built this palatial home on Point Grey Road, next door to what is now Stanley Park, McDonald and Point Grey Road. The house was named Killarney. And Jessie was a very prominent Conservative Party supporter and society matron. So she sort of went from a squatter's shack on the beach to Vancouver high society in the matter of just a few years. The site may be familiar to you now. It's occupied by that big white apartment building, Killarney Manor, at the corner of McDonald and where actually my parents lived for many years. So anyway, back to Greer's Beach. When they finally got Greer evicted, the CPR didn't immediately develop the property or Kitsilano generally or the beach specifically. Instead, it became a very popular campsite and swimming area for Vancouverites. A small tent community for recreational campers flourished, and you can see it in this picture here, dating from 1904. Finally, the city felt obliged to ban tenting for sanitary reasons, and instead they built a pavilion, brought in sand to create what is now Kitsilano Beach, shown here in 1920. Of course, the name, which was chosen by the CPR, refers to Chief Kitsilano, the Squamish chief who had moved into Burrard Inlet earlier in the 19th century and helped found the village of Slumped. Residential development spread up the slope behind the beach, especially after another streetcar line opened out 4th Avenue as far as Alma, the western limits of the city, in 1909. But of course, all the profits from land sales went to the CPR and not to Sam Greer. Another small colony of tent squatters sprang up in 1909, presumably because the street railway reached Alma Street at that time. It was at the foot of Alma Street on the beach, stretching a little west. In other words, just outside the city limits of Vancouver in what was then the municipality of Point Grey. It had its own elected council and named streets. One newspaper reporter who went to visit quoted one of the residents as saying, "This is what I call the ideal mode of living." And this photo from the City of Vancouver archives is captioned A.A. Bradbury sketching in forest at his camp at foot of Alma Street, dated 1912. So I like to think that Mr. Bradbury was a member of this little community of squatters, but perhaps this was just his own forest getaway where he went to paint. Anyway, in 1912, this community, like all the others, was forced to move. We now jump forward to the Depression era, the 30s. And with the stock market crash in 1929 and the onset of the Depression, Vancouver, of course, was swamped by unemployed transients looking for work and for social assistance. The Mecca of the unemployed is what the city was famously called by one official. In the spring of 1931, the situation got especially bad when the city reduced its relief payments. Yet city police were reporting as many as 75 to 100 jobless transients arriving in the city every day. So by June, there were several jungles, as they were called, sort of ramshackle hobo communities scattered around the East End. One of them on the site of the old Hastings Mill down on the Burrard Inlet, and others in the False Creek Flats. By the middle of the summer, there were more than 1,000 men living in these jungles. Shacks were made of scabbaged boards, boxes, crates. Rusted out car bodies were a favorite place to camp. The men obtained water from stagnant ponds, foraged for food, and begged for handouts. This photo shows one of the shelters. The Reverend Andrew Rodden, who was minister at First United Church at the time, was an outspoken advocate for the dispossessed in the city, and he came to champion the occupants of the jungles. He began a soup kitchen to help feed them and visited fairly regularly. Here he is on the right talking to one of the residents. In September 1931, Rodden asked his friend, the photographer W.J. Moore, to visit one of the camps on the False Creek Flats to take some photographs that Rodden thought he could use to publicize the plight of the occupants of the jungles. It was a drizzly evening. Moore described the inhabitants, quote, as men from everywhere, all sorts of ages, education, characters, attainments, and which a common want and some misery had banded together in larger or smaller groups for mutual help. This is another of Moore's photos. That's Rodden on the left visiting one of the shacks. W.J. Moore is worth a word. He was a well-known photographer in the city. He arrived here in 1912, established a photo studio in his home, and between 1913 and 28, he made panoramic photography a specialty of his business, using a highly specialized camera. In 1921, he opened a studio in the Winch Building on Hastings Street and was based there until he retired in 1953. So during his career, he did a lot of photography for Major Matthews, who was the city archivist. Rodden's attempts to rouse sympathy for the homeless men failed. Authorities saw the shanty towns as breeding grounds for crime, for disease, and worst of all, for social unrest. Shortly after Moore's visit, that's in September 1931, the city's medical officer reported an outbreak of typhoid in one of the jungles, giving the city the pretext it needed to send in crews and knock down the shelters, burning some of the shacks, smashing others into pieces. Most of the men were relocated to government work camps, which the provincial government opened later that fall in the interior of the province. Another cluster of squatters inhabited float homes in False Creek, on the north shore near the CPR Roundhouse, and on the south shore near Burrard Bridge, on the old Squamish village site of Snow. This image was taken in 1934 and shows one of the False Creek squatters at his float house sawing up scavenged wood, presumably for fuel. During the Depression, the area on the South Shore was known derisively as Bennettville, after Prime Minister R.B. Bennett, and was an allusion, of course, to his inability to do anything to solve the financial crisis. This is a shot of the site of Snock that I took last year, just beneath the south end of the Burrard Street Bridge. The next three images show the same general area in the 1950s. Remember that at this time, False Creek was an industrial center, an industrial cesspool, as one writer at the time called it, full of sawmills and factories and rail yards. The squatter community that was Bennettville persisted into the 1950s, when the residents were evicted, again for several reasons. There was, first of all, of course, plans were afoot to clean up False Creek a bit, which everybody in the city seemed to agree was rather a blight. And then in 1950, there was a spectacular murder. In November, at the end of the previous year, the body of a woman, Blanche Fisher, was found floating in False Creek. She had drowned, but she'd also been strangled and raped. A month later, police arrested Frederick Ducharme for vagrancy. It turned out he had a long record of indecent exposure convictions in cities across Western Canada, and he lived in one of the False Creek shacks. So when police searched it, they found items belonging to the dead woman. When the case went to trial early in 1950, Ducharme's odd behavior in court suggested he was probably mentally unstable, but he was convicted of murder and quickly hanged. The case played to the local prejudices against the squatter community and fears that the community was full of rapists and felons. At about this time as well, public health officials were concerned once again about typhoid in the shacks. And so for all these reasons, the waterfront residents were removed from False Creek during the 1950s. Another community of shackers was along the Burrard Inlet waterfront, just west of the Second Narrows, below Commissioner Street. This photo, which isn't very good, dates from 1936. It shows a solid row of float homes down along the waterfront here. During the 40s, the anthropologist Rolf Knight lived with his parents in a small home on Wall Street, just above this, and recalled the boathouses strung along the shore of the inlet. He wrote, "Since none of the inhabitants held title or paid taxes on these house sites, they received no municipal services of any kind. Neither electricity, nor water, nor sewage, nor any other service was extended to the boathouses. The dwellings jutted out from shore on pilings driven into the mud and ranged from single-room shacks to more substantial multi-room houses. Water was collected in rain barrels. Heat came from wood-burning stoves. The fuel was scavenged from the harbor." The worst thing about the boathouses, thought Knight, was that none of them had electricity. People used coal oil lamps, Coleman gas lanterns, candles were used when they ran out of gas, and of course there were no electrical appliances, not even a radio. Following World War II, a census showed that there were 866 shacks along the south shore of Burrard Inlet, reflecting the post-war housing shortage in the city. According to Knight, it was 1951 when these boathouses were removed by order of the National Harbors Board. No compensation was paid. The row of boathouses along Commissioner Street disappeared in less than 3 days. But this photo by Fred Herzog from the Vancouver Art Gallery shows some of the squatter shacks down along the shore, and it is dated 1961, which seems to contradict the 1950s date. Regardless, it shows some of the features of the cabin, the stilts carrying the building out over the water, the wood-burning stoves, and what appears to be, this time, to be electrical wires taking power to the cabins. If this was 1961, these cabins were presumably gone very soon after. Moving further east along the shore of Burrard Inlet, out to the other side of the Second Narrows Bridge into Burnaby, another squatter community had emerged known as Crabtown. This is a shot of it in 1930. One of these shacks was occupied briefly by the late local historian Chuck Davis, who as a 9-year-old boy, so that would be in 1944, he came to the city from Winnipeg with his father. And he recorded that for $300, Dad bought a squatter's shack on the south shore of Burrard Inlet in Burnaby. I didn't know what a squatter was, but I did know I loved the place. Ours was one of a long row of shacks linked by a boardwalk right beside the train tracks. When trains went by, the whole shack trembled. It's not known precisely when Crabtown originated. I think it's probably before World War I, maybe during World War I, and then during the 1930s, the population expanded somewhat. So that by 1957, when the residents were relocated and their homes were demolished again by the Harbors Board, there were actually 114 residences and about 130 residents. This was not a slum. It was a neighborhood with families who had children, who went to school, parents who went to work. The residents even constructed their own water system. A typical family were the Rintonens. This is a photo of daughter Trudy. The Rintonens, Gastown and Kitsilano, and their 2 young daughters arrived in the lower mainland from the prairies in 1936 looking for work. The following year they paid $50 for a 2-room cabin in Crabtown, sitting on a platform supported by pilings out over the water. Though the homes are usually called shacks, they were often very neatly kept, if small, houses, I think as this photo implies. According to Burnaby Heritage, Gustav eventually found a job at a nearby sawmill, and Aune worked in the kitchen in a Vancouver restaurant. In other words, they were not destitute, they belonged to the working poor, and in fact, they used their cabin as a starter home, moving in 1946 to a small house and selling the cabin for $200. This is another view of the Crabtown community from the water. If it originated before World War I and extended through to 1957, it was perhaps the longest lasting of all the squatting neighborhoods around Burrard Inlet. On the other side of the inlet, opposite Crabtown on the north shore, around Roche Point, in what is now Kate's Park, was the location of one of the more famous squatter communities on land occupied for millennia by the Tsleil-Waututh people. This is where for 14 years, from 1940 to 1954, the novelist Malcolm Lowry, shown here, and his wife Marjorie Bonner lived. Most of Lowry's famed novel, Under the Volcano, was written in his 2-room shack on the beach. While the presence of the Lowrys attracted a steady stream of literary visitors to the site, most of their neighbors were actually fishermen, beachcombers, men who had jobs at the local mills. This is the Robert Dollar sawmill, which gave Dollarton its name. It went into operation in 1917, producing lumber from wood cut on the slopes of Mount Seymour, and shipping it all over the world. It was quite isolated at that time, Roche Point, the Dollarton area. No road access until the early 30s. So most of the people who worked at the mill lived at the town site next door. For a worker who lived with his family at one of the company houses, the rent was $15 a month, which included water, electricity, and a supply of wood. But quite possibly some of the single men would have preferred to live in the beachfront cabins next door to the Lowrys. In the early 50s, you could buy a one-room waterfront cabin, complete with outhouse, for $100. The wooden cabins at Lazy Bay, as this community became known, about 90 of them in all, were built on stilts below the high water mark, again, or on floats, and connected to dry land by plank walkways. Most of them were burned by the District of North Vancouver in 1958. But of course, one survived, the Blue Cabin, the subject of the exhibition, which brings us all here. We learned last week from Jeremy Borsos that this particular cabin was built in the 1920s over in Cole Harbor and then relocated in the 30s across the inlet to the Cates Park area, next door to the barge company where the owner of the cabin had found work. From 1966, of course, it was occupied by Al Neal, a few years later joined by Carol Itter. They occupied the cabin until they were evicted in 2015 and the project to preserve the building began. But there's one more community of Burrard Inlet squatters I want to mention. A little to the west of Lazy Bay, on the Maplewood Flats at the mouth of McCartney Creek, again in the District of North Vancouver, there was another short-lived squatter community of artists and hippies in the late 60s, early 70s. The two groups, the Maplewood squatters and the Cates Park cabins, are often conflated or confused, but they were two distinct communities in two different time periods. The Maplewood community was small. It included Paul Spong, who went on to establish a whale research station up the coast, Orca Lab, which has done very important research about coastal whale populations. And also Tom Burrows, a very well-known artist who has done lots of work on the history of squatting himself. The Maplewood squat was the subject of an NFB documentary in 1972, Mudflats Living, by which time the District of North Vancouver had evicted the squatters and destroyed their homes, ostensibly to make way for a shopping center, which actually was never developed. Local authorities argued that the dwellings did not conform to health and safety standards, as was usually the case when squatters were removed. The site is now a bird sanctuary, the Maplewood Conservation Area, where the shacks are memorialized by artist Ken Lum's installation From Shangri-La to Shangri-La, which are scale replicas of 3 of the shacks set down in the woods near the water. I took this photograph of one of the replicas a couple of years ago. I believe it's the Malcolm Lowry cabin. The other cabins in this installation are ones that belong to, are miniatures of ones that belong to Tom Burrows and Paul Spong. I suppose I don't have to point out the irony of the district government, first of all, destroying these houses and then purchasing replicas to memorialize them at the site of the destruction. So this was the last of the foreshore squatting communities. Of course, there's a whole other history of squatting in the city that's not necessarily in the same tradition as the foreshore squatters' shacks. I'm thinking of squats that are in protest against homelessness and gentrification and the lack of affordable housing. The Woodward squat, for example, in 2002, or squats that are going on around the city right now. These are protests, whereas the foreshore squatters that I've been talking about, while sometimes disadvantaged and marginalized, were not necessarily protesting anything. They didn't want publicity for a cause. They, in fact, wanted to be left alone so they could get on with their lives, which sometimes they were, at least for a short time, before the land they occupied was needed for economic development and the cabins were destroyed. The term squatter has, of course, had a pejorative connotation during the city's history, I guess because of its connection to vagrancy and poverty and freeloading. Or maybe they were just considered aesthetically displeasing. But what I hope I've conveyed this evening is exactly the reverse, that the foreshore squats were occupied by a wide variety of people, mill workers, tavern keepers, hobos, artists, even murderers and writers. Most of them had jobs, some of them raised families there. So as a historian, what I particularly like about the Blue Cabin project is that by its preservation, it acknowledges the role that these people played in the history of the city. It doesn't make them respectable, perish the thought, but it does sort of nudge them away from the margins of the history and more towards the main story. So thank you very much for being such an attentive audience, and I'm sure there's for questions or hopefully more interestingly comments about your own experiences with squatters and squatting.
How about Finn Slough?
Yeah, people always ask about Finn Slough. Luckily, tonight's about Burrard Inlet, so I don't, because I don't know a lot about, maybe somebody else does. I don't know a lot about Finn Slough.
I live there.
Ah, there you go.
Interesting.
You can talk to me afterwards. There.
Ah, you live there now?
I live there. I lived there for 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the situation there in regards to the federal government is the Port Authority was amalgamated into one super port authority about 8 years ago. We know now as Port Vancouver. And back in the day, the waterfront from Steveston and up to maybe around where the tunnel is was managed by the Steveston Harbor Authority. And I guess with a lot of sort of deed transition, there was some confusion as to what the legal status of places like Finn Slough were. And so that piece of land is in perpetual, I guess you could call it dispute limbo. And there was a person who purchased a piece of paper that entitled him to it in the early 90s, but he didn't have the legal or financial abilities to pair up with the port to create some kind of condo development. And I think that sort of says something about how the foreshore, even though it's a federal kind of reserve area, can be developed, but the government has to have some kind of need to really act on it. Otherwise, they're too lazy and too far away to care. And so that's why some of these places last longer than others in the way I see it.
So Finn Slough is a formal or an informal squatters community?
We prefer the term homestead because we were actually there before anyone cared about the land. So it wasn't really even private land or considered government land. It was just unwanted land. And that was back in the 1890s when the Finns first settled there because they were, marginal people who didn't have the ability to own land, but it was land that no one wanted at the time. So there's been this sort of succession of house ownership that has kind of perpetuated, which was a big part of the legal case against this purported landowner who suddenly purchased this piece of paper. But there was a lineage.
People sell?
People cannot sell the land because the land is in dispute, but people do sell buildings there.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, we went back there, actually.
Hi. Yeah.
Okay, one,
Yeah.
and then over here.
Given the housing issues in the city, I'm curious if you think that what you presented today offers, maybe not like literally a model as in on the water, but offers some sort of model for resistance to legal or maybe even illegal enforcement of like unfair housing in the city. It's a big question.
Yes, it is.
I think it's like we look at the past now, like what can that teach us about the future?
Yeah, I never conceived this as offering a model for anything.
Not even a model, just anything that we could, you think that we could take from it.
I don't know, maybe other people have
Yeah.
responses to that. I'll think about it. Yeah.
Question here.
Yeah.
Francis. I'm Marcia Crosby. Thanks very much for your talk tonight. I really appreciate all the ideas and the histories of people who moved in and out of Burrard Inlet on either foreshore. I don't think there's ever been a time when people weren't really interested in who was settling where. Was that the comment that you made? Before people were interested? You mean non-native people, right?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Oh, I think it depends on just what's at stake for the parties who have a stake in it. You know, that will determine
Okay.
the fight that gets put up.
Government speak, that's good. I really like the diversity of people who live there and all of the claims that they made to it, just for coming from elsewhere, living, just coming into a really rugged place and saying, I'm going to live here, and even though it was rough and new and everything else. And I think that is probably what a lot of the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh people, really, why they were able to make friends with so many people. But this is just another question off to the side. Like a lot of what you were talking about is the ruggedness of the place, but I read a lot of sort of really early texts on people who came through, and they would see the Squamish people coming down Burrard Inlet, or people who came up from the interior, and they would be like huge bands, First Nations musical bands, playing on the river, coming through Burrard Inlet. Huge, one of the first introductions to people singing songs and having beautiful, huge, talking about the Squamish, having huge fireworks and Squamish people on Burrard Inlet singing in their own languages, in Latin and French and English, so that the people in Vancouver, the newcomers, would actually go out in huge barges and go out. And then other people that, many British people came and looked around and said, oh wow, there's a lot of, lumber and all these kinds of things. But what they were astounded by was going into these shacks, and most of them were Squamish people's shacks, and they found pianos in there. And so there is this really other whole sensibility and this whole really amazing history of people that were well, sure, they were hanging with the Roman Catholics, the old ladies of Mary Immaculate, but they were high-powered people, many high-powered people, and they mixed with all those, right? They intermarried with them, they mixed with all those people. So these were people that I think what you're talking about, all these people that were came and were willing to settle in these places, I think they must have had many interrelationships, not just Gassy Jack, but but with many of the Squamish and Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh people who already had preceded them in terms of bringing into the world that they lived in many forms of modernity, modernization, and all those kinds of things. So, and I think maybe, I don't know, it's just a thought that maybe those really rough shacks and, maybe some of those squatters from far away places might have had a piano or two inside. Yeah, maybe. It's just a thought. It's just this throw it out there, in outside of labor, but just people who wanted to live here and became friends with many of the Indigenous people who lived here.
This one had a piano in it.
Did it?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
It's actually, there's an artist who's taken the piano and she's making pieces of it.
But that's in the sort of if you go into British libraries, that's sort of if you're interested, If you go into really old texts from the 1890s and that are published everywhere, New York and Britain, everywhere, many people were interested in what was going on the West Coast and what was going on with First Nations people. And it's a whole other modern / squatters history, kind of. But yeah, that's what I like is that what you brought to the floor today for all of these different interest groups, all of these different people who wanted to make a space here for themselves, and they were many different people. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Appreciate your talk. Thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Those both were amazing. I think John is next, and then we have
Okay,
somebody down
John.
there. Okay.
Just a really quick comment with Mr. Greer. He didn't actually fade out. He moved off to Chilliwack, but he actually fought the case. And he took it back to court. And there were 2 federal parliamentary inquiries that both exonerated him and said that he was a legal occupant of the
Yeah.
property, but refused to compensate him. And the provincial government held an inquiry into the situation as well, and censured the CPR because they refused to show up after the query. And so they actually sent an arrest warrant for their lawyer to make him appear after the query. And then also said that Greer was the legal owner of the land, but also refused to compensate. So he morally was correct, but they didn't offer any recompense from taking.
Yeah.
They
The
did.
further footnote to that is that there was a secret payment of $40,000 that the CPR made to Greer to shut everybody out.
And
But the best thing
what
is
point was
that Greer
this?
got out of jail after shooting the sheriff
Yes?
on a deal with the Catholic Church. Greer was an Orangeman, Irish Protestant, and there was a Catholic priest in the pen, a child molester. And the Catholics and the Orangemen compromised and let them both out. They both got pardoned. Greer couldn't get out alone. Well,
Anyway, it's just
Okay, yes.
My name's Gloria. I was wondering how far east the settler, the squatters shack community sort of went. You went about as far east as Burnaby, but did it ever reach Port Moody?
You know, I don't know. I haven't read of any, but it would be unlikely that they didn't.
Okay.
Well, there's those cabins in Belcarra
That's right.
that they're trying to say that people lived in Belcarra. I don't think anybody owns them. And they've been in, because during the whole time when we were in the news around the Blue Cabin,
Yeah?
they were also in the news that they were.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
They were gonna tear them down,
Yeah.
and one of the artists, Joe Lettington, lived in one of them.
Uh-huh.
A bunch of people, but I think there's been some compromises of which ones they tore down and which ones they didn't. Yeah, because I don't think they tore them all down, and they saved some, and they pushed people out of some. I don't remember all the details.
Just a comment, because I just watched it a week ago, the Mudflat People National Film Board video.
Yeah?
I only watched it once, but compared to your discussion today, to me, it really backs it up in that it showed the quotations hippies. There was the one artist there, but it also showed the mayor sort of saying, we can't have these people living here. It showed, I'm going to call him Chief George, but I know that's the wrong one. But
Son.
yeah, from the Tsleil-Waututh talking about it. So it sort of showed all the different facets that you've talked about. So it's a nice backup to this presentation. So if you haven't seen it, it's just it's National Film Board, the Mud People, just Google it.
Mud Flat Living. It's
Yeah, Mud
yes,
Flat Living. There you go.
I saw it myself. You can see it online.
Yeah.
I have an addendum to that. There's a film that covers the same community made by Les Blanc. I saw it in the Cinematheque about 15 years ago. And if you know or anyone knows what it's called, I had no luck finding it online.
Supposedly it's out at UBC.
Is that right?
I'm trying to follow that link,
Hmm.
but it seems to be, I'm pretty sure if you went to the UBC library, they'd be able to find it because it was his thesis or something.
Okay, it actually covers the eviction.
Yeah.
And it's like a head-to-head between, they have a Renaissance fair, and it's all very happy, and then the bulldozers show up, and the bulldozer driver, he says, I can't do this. Just morally, I can't do this, so someone else comes in the next day and operates the bulldozer. But it covers it right up to the last minute, pretty much. It's quite a good film.
Les Black's distribution company in California is called Flower Films. Flower Films. So if you look it up under Flower Films, I think they have his entire catalog. Huge.
And there's a new book coming out, New Star Books, this spring, I think. I can't remember the name of the title, but it's a kind of history which is partly about the Maplewood Flats community and those 2 or 3 years that people were there, and comparing it to a squatter community in Surrey, which I didn't know anything about. So if you check the New Star website, I'm sure you can find a reference to it.
There's a question here.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I'm really fascinated with Crabtown, and I'm wondering if that Herzog photograph is actually of there, rather
You think?
Well, if you look at it, it looks like what, I was just out there actually.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of a sign, an indication that it existed. And that looks to me what is across the water from there, not what you would see from
Oh, yeah.
the other side. Plus, I think, can we go back to that photo? Because I think you can actually see a little bit of the Second Narrows Bridge, because the Second Narrows,
Tell me when you see it.
it's the color one.
Pretty soon there.
Is that not the Second Narrows Bridge in the very left
Oh,
corner?
yeah.
And that's what's across, it's Dillingham is across from, was across from the other site. So I think that's actually Crabtown. It'll be about 1957.
Okay.
Or
But-
after the bridge is in.
But still, the date seems, 61 seems wrong.
The sign
I
that
thought
they,
that Crabtown was,
the plaque they have says that it came down in 57,
yeah,
but maybe
yeah.
aren't that accurate.
But yes, you're probably right.
So where did you figure this is then?
The Crabtown, the Burnaby site. Yeah.
I got a question for you, and thank you very much for this great presentation. I learned a lot. I was wondering whether or not all of this construction of these shacks, somehow in my mind I was thinking it was going to be mostly driftwood. I'm not sure exactly what I was thinking, but it's mostly dimensional lumber, and so I wondered whether or not they'd be really possible without the lumber industry and people being able to scavenge the mill waste. I don't know if there's comments about that or whether it's true or not, but it seems like, oh, you wouldn't be able to, if they're not affording land, they probably wouldn't be able to afford to buy all that lumber. And so, you know, my guess, just looking at, especially the earlier ones, this is not a good representation of that, was that it was, you know, made a lot of it from mill waste.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I
There's
think
a lot
it-
of sawmills around those
Yeah.
days. There's lots of little sawmills around.
So in that sense, like no lumber industry, then, you know, no squatting.
Well, actually, one of the interesting things, if you look at this green building with the rounded roof, yellow chimney, that's actually one of the old houseboats from Cold Harbor. There's a whole houseboat industry where the shipyards of Cold Harbor built slews of these things. You then rented for the season. They towed it over to where the Royal Vancouver Yacht Club's outstation is at Stanley Park, and they rafted them out in the harbor there, just off Anderson Point. And so you then would row out and camp at your houseboat through the season. And so then, when the harbor became much more industrial, the houseboat companies dispersed the fleet. They just got rid of them, and that was the genesis of many of the first of the squatters' cabins, because they sold them off for $20 each or something. And many of the original cabins had this rounded roof form, and so you can always tell where a houseboat has been then shored up under pilots because it has that curved roof. Of course. And those floated off into Bennetville and other places and things. And some of the other shacks were actually hauled down from logging camps.
Yeah,
And behind the tugboats and stuff in the mills out there close, they would raft these shacks out and would float them, and then they came down during the Depression and other places. So there's a scavenged bits, and then there's also these repurposed dwellings for other things.
I think that might have been the design, because we were trying to find the design of these things, and somebody at the opening was saying that they were actually built for the logging industry. They would use them, they'd push them on the high water mark on pontoons and use them to protect the log loop so that there's somebody could stay there and make sure that they weren't doing. And he was saying that this design was the Swedish and the Norwegian used to use this design, but you can't find it in any Swedish or Norwegian. So it seems like it was a design that they designed for the West Coast. It's not, you can't find it in any, we haven't been able to find any reference to it in Norwegian or Swedish architecture. But the guy also said that the Finnish did them really different. I don't know what that meant, but he said that the Finnish actually did them as well. But you could tell the Swedish and the Norwegian ones were all looked like this, and the Finnish were completely different. Okay.
But isn't it the case that when the Oblates came, they worked with the Squamish in all the two reserves, because Tsleil-Waututh was still living in the Mission Reserve. Isn't it a fact that they actually built all of their homes, like really nice, neat little homes, like from 1860 something on? So by the 1880s, I mean, there's already, all the Squamish are working in the lumber mills. They're all making their own houses. They're building their own churches. Every Roman Catholic church that was built was this neat little nice place. In fact, they bragged about how well these churches were made. And all those people, like Gassy Jack's wife, the First Nations, all the Squamish, and they all were intermingling with them. They were the most famous people. They were actually talked about as, they were very famous because lumbering and filling, sort of like the lumber stations was the most dangerous job on the West Coast. And that was their job. All the Squamish worked in that space for a long time till the unions came in after the 1900s. So it wasn't about like getting bits and pieces in shacks. I think that they hung around with a lot of Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh people enough to know how to build a small, decent shack and house. And I agree with whoever was talking about the business of how do you get the lumber? Well, I'm sure there are ways to get bits and pieces of lumber out of places and build these things, right? Am I wrong?
No,
Please
you're
tell
not
me.
wrong.
Just a thought.
Okay. Thank you.